this week's episode of the blog. I hope that you've been well in the time since we published our last episode. Now today we're discussing a very interesting topic, which is online hate speech, with a particular focus on the recently commemorated day, the International Day of Countering Hate Speech, which was commemorated on the 18th of June. It is commemorated every year on this day. It has been running since 2019. And one of the mandates really, or the commitments of this day is to really hold social media companies accountable for any forms of online hate speech that may manifest on their platforms. Now, hate speech is already a very broad topic. Online hate speech is equally quite broad. But to put it quite simply, online hate speech is any forms of manifestation of hateful content online that incite people to violence or to other forms of hateful actions. And so one really interesting thing that has been happening, not just with this year, but then previously, the global organization Global Witness, which is a social justice organization, has been running campaigns with social media companies to see if and how they moderate online hate speech. Now, one of the most widely spoken of examples of their work in this area was last year in the build-up to the Kenyan elections. Now, the Kenyan elections have a history of being somewhat violent in certain times, and this is not to say that Kenyan elections are always violent, but we do know that in 2007 there was a lot of incitement to violence that happened, tribalistic incitements. And that was a very famous election, very contested election. And so Kenya continues to be this space for interrogation of if and how hate speech still may manifest in the build-up to elections. And so Global Witness ran this test with a legal company, Foxglove, to see if they ran content that was intentionally hateful, had intentionally hateful language, if Facebook would publish it on its platform. And quite surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly to some of you, these adverts ran and they were in English and Swahili, and they had lots of content that was tribalistic and incitement to violence, to physical violence, to rape and very violent acts. And so that brought up a lot of questions around the content moderation of these companies and platforms and how strong they are. Now, Global Witness has just run another campaign, this time in South Africa. South Africa, we know, has a very xenophobic context that has been brewing and growing for many years. And there is a particular xenophobic sentiment towards Zimbabweans, who are the largest group of foreigners in the South African nation space. Last year, we know of the murder of Elvis Nyati of Diepsloot, and how that brought out a lot of actions by South Africans around this xenophobic sentiment. Hashtags like "Put South Africans First," "Zimbabweans Must Go," "Zimbabweans Must Fall," and this Operation Dudula, which became very popular at that time, which were all fomenting this xenophobic sentiment. So we know that there is already a context that's very rife for this kind of hate speech. And so they ran a campaign or a test with the Legal Resources Center in South Africa to see if they published content or if they sent adverts to these social media platforms, TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook, if this content would again go through the content moderators. And sure enough, yes, most of it did go through. This was content in English, Afrikaans, Zulu, and Xhosa. They report that one of their adverts went across the board, and this was one in which there was incitement for police to kill people, to kill foreigners. And so some of these adverts did not go through in certain languages. However, the fact that this one advert, which was incitement to get officials, state officials to kill foreigners, went through is very alarming. They immediately unpublished these adverts, because obviously now they were published, they'd gone through. But then this brings up a lot of issues and questions around the strength of the content moderation policies and teams and work that is being done by these content moderators. We know that a lot of companies are now using more AI to supplement some of their content moderation, but the AI is obviously not intelligent enough, and the human component is not strong enough. And this is a concern. We know that content moderators are generally paid poorly, exposed to harrowing content, watching all kinds of violence, suicides, anything and everything that can be published online. They have to watch that content and then moderate it. So they're already quite overwhelmed, and they're underpaid. There have been actions by content moderators in different countries on the African continent who have tried to hold these social media companies accountable. One such was a Kenyan last year who filed a legal suit against Facebook and Sama, which is the outsourcing company that most of these social media companies use to get people who then help with the content moderation. And so, there's already actions like that. Kenya, again, recently, content moderators have taken on an action against Facebook again with regards tax remittances and, miscalculations of salaries and, all kinds of things that are happening that are quite exploitative to their labor. And so, with all these things happening, one has to ask these questions that, I'm always asking on the podcast as well as the vlog, around how important social media companies see their African users. Africa is a huge continent of so many people and so many users online who are engaging in these spaces. In fact, Africa may be the last frontier for a lot of these social media companies, which are starting to sort of die out in some parts of the Western world, because millennials are moving out of using social media as consistently as they used to. So Africans are still on Facebook in very very communal ways that Western audiences aren't so much. And so what does it mean when one of your potentially largest user bases for the future is not catered to? Their languages are not taken into consideration, the content moderators are underpaid, and there seems to be no real engagement with the diversity of the language groups on the continent, which there are so many of. And once one really thinks about the diversity of the linguistic diversity on the continent, yes, you can make an argument and say, well, it's impossible to cover every language. However, there are dominant languages. Swahili is one of them. It's probably the one most spoken language besides colonial languages, English and French, on the continent. I'd say Afrikaans and Zulu and Xhosa are very big language groups on the continent, but yet still the moderation policies, the moderation actions or strategies do not cover being able to catch content that is insightful to violence on these platforms. In fact, even English itself kind of goes through the gate. So there's something there that really needs a lot more action, a lot more activism around, because definitely there is this imbalance in the ways that Africans are very much engaged on these platforms, but that their needs are not catered to. Now, on a more practical level, what can we do? We as individuals perhaps cannot hold these companies to account in ways that will make them change, but I think there is a role for the individual user to be aware that what we read online is not always moderated, it is not always, hasn't passed through a system of verification and authentication. And so, again, to always be very constant in our understanding that, you know, if we see hate speech, if we see something that's an incitement to violence, we do have a role to report it. Now, whether or not anything happens after that is neither here nor there. But I think the only action we can continue to take is to be active users of the social media terrain, and also just to not be hurtful and harmful. Hate speech is totally unnecessary. A lot of people will say that, you know, people feel emboldened to say things they'd never say to your face online because they can hide behind anonymity, and they can always delete it. I think there is a role for us to continue to be common, to be decent human beings to one another, and to never speak to another person in a way that you would not want to be spoken to. So I think, you know, there's a role for us to keep thinking and communicating and having conversations around this day. It is a day, but hate speech is such a common theme, and has been for so long. So here's some food for thought for you, and I really would like to hear your own feedback about this. You can send comments, feedback to info@digitallinativepodcast.com, or else find us on Twitter @nativepodcast, on Facebook on the Digitally Native Podcast with Fungai Machirori, and on LinkedIn at the same name, the Digitally Native Podcast with Fungai Machirori.